we're going to skip quite a bit. So where I want you to open your books to is actually page 16, right-hand column. You know, this is happening in around the year 625 or so. Okay, remember, Augustine comes to Canterbury in 597, so it's not quite 30 years after the beginning of the Roman Catholic missionaries to Anglo-Saxon England. And the story we're given in Bede here is recounting the conversion of King Edwin of Northumbria to Christianity. And we're told at the beginning of the passage, part that we're not going to talk about, or that we're not going to go over closely. We're told in the beginning that part of the agreement that Edwin makes to marry his wife, who is a Christian, is that he will become a Christian, and part of that is because Edwin had difficulty securing the kingship. And so he agreed to become a Christian if God would help him become king. He becomes king, and he kind of reneges on the deal, as it were. So he has a vision, and the vision, tells him, if this thing happens to you, then that's a sign to you. This is proof, blah, 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 blah. The thing happens. Man puts his hand on his head and all this kind of stuff. And so Edwin invites Paulinus to come talk to him about essentially Jesus. And I want to pick up at the bottom of page 16 on the right-hand column. Edwin has himself personally agreed to become a Christian. His wife's already a Christian. But before he, steps in the font, as it were, he says, I think it would be best if not only I became a Christian, but all my men, my priests, etc., do it with me. And Paulinus says, yeah, that's probably a pretty good idea. Why don't you go confer with your counselors and your priestly advisors? Now, what kind of priests does Edwin have? What are they priests of?
They're going to be priests of some sort of Norse cult.
Pagan Germanic religion, okay? Which we don't really know exactly what the pagan Germans prior to about 1000 AD believed, because we don't have any real source. The earliest surviving Old Norse material dates from about 1000. That is, the actual surviving stuff dates from about 1300. So it's 500 years after what a good, thoroughgoing pagan Germanic person would have believed. And it's all written down by Christians, who may have changed some of the stories a little bit. Okay? Anyways, Bede gives us this account, that the king goes to his priests, and Coifi, who is the chief of his priests, says these words to the king. Consider, O king, this new doctrine that is being preached to us. For I say to you truly that as far as I can tell, the religion we have practiced until now has no virtue in it. That is, it doesn't have any power. It doesn't have any efficacy. It doesn't do us any good. None of your people has devoted himself more diligently to the worship of our gods than I. That is, of all of your people, I'm the holiest according to our religion. I follow all the rules. I do what's prescribed, the whole 9 yards. Okay, so he's setting that up on one side. And yet, here comes the other side, there are many who receive greater favors and greater honor from you than I do, and are more prosperous in all their undertakings. What is he saying? Okay, I mean, you could take this initially as this is a slam against the king. Here I am, I'm the holiest person according to our religion, and you don't show me the proper respect by giving me favors and gifts and kindness and all this kind of stuff. That's one way of taking it. The other way of taking it is the way he suggests. Okay? If our gods were really real and such, if they had power, they would have helped me more readily. That is, if our gods were real and they had power, it only stands to reason. Notice, he's not sitting here emoting. He's not going, oh, I just feel like the gods don't love me because... He's using cold, clear rationality and logic. If the gods were real and the gods paid any attention to someone following the laws, doing what is necessary, then, ergo, I should be the most blessed person in the world, since I have been more careful to serve them. It follows, therefore, that if on examination those new doctrines which are now preached to us are found to be better and more effective, we should accept them immediately and without delay. So he's essentially saying, I'm already ready to chuck our religion. It's not doing me any good. I'm not getting any better off in this life. So he says, if this new religion is better and more effective, well, define better. Does he mean if this new religion is going to guarantee me worldly wealth? That's not what he means. He means if it is more rational and more effective, okay, then we should accept it. So what does he mean by more effective? Okay, that's what this information's for. Koifi is the priest of the pagan religion. So what do they believe? And again, all of the information comes from essentially much later. But we kind of assume that the earlier forebears of the Germanic peoples believed at least most of this too. So, what does pagan Germanic mythology say? What us in the future?
When you die, hell, with one L.
Possibly, okay, yeah.
And, or if you die in battle, you get to go to Valhalla.
Battle, if you're a warrior, you die in battle, you die with your sword in your hand. That's what that means. If you die without your sword in your hand, you don't go to Valhalla. You go to hell. EL, which is just a really cold place. It's all it is. It's a really cold place that kind of sucks. People walk around sighing all day long. Okay? Think, middle of February in, not Middle Tennessee, but probably Minnesota. Okay? What else? Okay, that's kind of temporary. What ultimately happens?
Oh, right.
Okay. The ultimate end, that is when you get to the end of time, Ragnarok happens. Well, what's Ragnarok? In a nutshell, this is it. Okay, you've all seen or heard about Thor. It's not the character of the movie. And so you have this series of gods, and there are two levels of these gods. We're only going to talk about the ice here. Odin, Thor, Loki, Tyr, Balder, Hother. Okay, and there's another one whose name I didn't put down. Freyr. Okay, we get names for from these guys. Tyr, Tuesday. Woden, Woden's Day, Wednesday. Thor, Thursday. Freyr, Friday. Okay, so that's our days of the week are named after pagan gods. All right, most of them are. So here, Loki, everybody knows, he's the trickster god. He likes playing practical jokes. The only difference is his practical jokes always have a very dark tinge to them. That is, they're not the kind of practical joke you play on your best friend. They're the kind of practical joke you play on somebody you really hate. So you're really trying to stick the knife in and twist it, right? So he's always doing all kinds of things that are screwing up with the gods. And so Odin or Thor have to go make things right. Well, here's what happens. Oh, there's a couple others that I didn't mention. These, I'll put these in red. These aren't gods. Fenris Ulf and the world serpent. Fenris Ulf is a wolf, and the world serpent is a serpent. Giant snake who encircles the world in the ocean, sound asleep, until the end of time. That is Ragnarok. Okay? Fenris Ulf is chained. He's bound up. And he's going to be tied in with Ragnarok. So, Loki, at some point off in the future...
Aren't both of these Loki's children too?
Yeah, something like that. Loki, at some point off in the future, when the gods are having a party, and it's pretty much what they do, the gods are having a party, and they're sitting there and they're shooting arrows and throwing spears at Balder. Well, Balder can't be killed. Well, take that back. He can. See, all the gods can die. Okay? Balder can be killed only one way. If he is pierced with a sprig of mistletoe. Like you get to stick him in the arm, he'll die. Okay? So, while away at the time, they're sitting there throwing spears at him. He's pulling them out, shooting him with arrows because none of these things hurt him. Well, Loki blindfolds Balder's brother, Huther. These two names are going to show up in modified form in Beowulf. Okay, it's kind of an interesting little parallel. Loki blindfolds Hother, and Hother thinks he's, throwing a spear at Balder, but the spear is tipped with mistletoe. So Hother kills Balder. As a result, Fenris Ulf is unbound, the Midgard serpent, or the world serpent, rises out of the ocean. Tyr gets his hand bit off because he goes to stop Fenris Ulf, etc. And all hell breaks loose. In other words, this is the beginning of what's called Ragnarok. Okay? Richard Wagner, in his Ring cycle, the big magnum opus operatic cycle, calls this the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods. Okay? For a reason. In Ragnarok, what happens is you have these sides go to war. And the two sides are composed of gods, men, and slain warriors. Right? Because when they die, if they die in battle with their sword or axe or spear in their hand, the Valkyries come and take them from the place of battle, and they take them off to Valhalla. Well, who are the Valkyries? The Valkyries are the slaughter. Okay? Valhalla is the slaughter hall. So the slaughter maiden, Hild, okay, come, they take the souls of the dead warriors and they take them off to Valhalla. There's nothing but a great big frat party. I mean, all they do in Valhalla for seemingly all eternity and joust and fight and kill each other again because they're already dead. But no problem with that. Okay? So they're just having this great Valhalla. Ragnarok comes, and it's time for all those dead, slain warriors to now come to earth and fight on the side of the gods and men. The Valkyries come fight also. Okay? And they're going to fight against Loki, giants, dwarves, Orkneys, where Tolkien gets his name, orcs, okay? Giants, elves, unlikable people or things, okay? Midgets, pygmies, non-standard human, think non-Aryans, essentially, okay? So you could kind of think of these two like this. These are the forces of order. These are the forces of chaos. All right? So forces of order and forces of chaos. Hold on just a second, let me put that over there for a moment so I get it on that recording. So what happens?
The gods lose.
Yeah. The forces of order lose. Or if you want to put it this way, good and evil, good loses. Evil wins. Chaos triumphs. Turn off the light when you leave the room, because that's it. Okay. This is according to most versions of the Germanic mythology. There is one version that does have, after all this, Balder is reborn. And there is a quote-unquote new heaven and new earth. And from that point on, everything is perfect. Okay. A lot of people, a lot of mythologists say Germanic mythology has its ultimate source in Christian mythology. Okay. We won't go into that. So, this is the ultimate end. Chaos and evil win. How positive is that for an outlook on life? No matter what you do, it doesn't matter. Bad is triumphant. Okay? So, just kind of let that sink in for a while. Now, I don't think it's coincidence, and there are quite a few scholars who well, maybe not quite a few, but there are some, who think the same thing. I don't think it's coincidence that of all the Indo-European languages, okay, but you can ask me later about what that means, but all the languages that descend from this little group of people that existed about 7,000 BC, only one of those languages doesn't have a future tense. Germanic. Latin has a future tense. Greek has a future tense. The Celtic languages have a future tense. The Slavic languages have a future tense. The Indian languages, not Native American, but these kind of Indian, you know. Okay. Those have a future tense. Germanic languages don't. English is Germanic. Okay? Why do I say we don't have a future tense? Take the verb, the infinitive verb, to run. Make that present tense. You could say, I run. You run. Doesn't change. He, she, it runs. Okay? That is, to make that third person singular, you add something. What about past tense? I ran, you ran, he, she, it ran. Okay? The verb changes. Make it plural. Make it future. You can't. That is, with just this verb, you cannot make it future. What do? We add what's called a modal auxiliary. We have to add another word in order to indicate futurity. Shall or will. Okay? All of the other Indo-European languages, they do something like one of these. They add an ending or the vowel changes to indicate futurity. Germanic is the only one. Do you think it possibly has anything to do with this? What does the future hold?
Chaos.
Nothing. Chaos. Okay. So there are some scholars who think this could be why the Germanic language doesn't have a future tense. Because this is also kind of unique. That the world ends in utter blackness and despair. Nihilism reigns supreme. This is, the ideology of suicide, as it were. Okay? So, back to Bede. When Coife says, if there is a new doctrine which are found by us to be better and more effective, yeah, we should accept those. Okay? So the king's like, okay, that's cool. So then another one of the priests also agrees. And he tells us a little story. And he says, O king, This is how the present life of man seems to me. Okay? In comparison with that time which is unknown to us. Well, what's that time which is unknown to us? What came before us, whether personally, that is, before I was born, where was I, or what was I, or even was I, and what happens when we die. Now, what plagues him? It's not to be or not to, well, and another reason. Why he gives the to be or not to be speech. Because he knows. So, this advisor to the king says, this is what the present life of man seems to me like. It's as if you're sitting in your feasting hall with your and things is about as far north as Nova Scotia. Cold, nice. Middle of the hall and inside is warm. Okay, but he says you're sitting with your things in Alderman. So what is he implying there? He's not implying you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs. You've got a big fire burning in the middle of the hall. You're surrounded by all of your nobility, all your noblemen. And you're probably singing the accompaniment of a harp, while outside the winter storms of rain and snow are raging. So it's cozy inside by the wind. It's no longer a brief little bit of heat, a little bit of song, and then it flies out the next window and it's back in ruin. But after the briefest moment of calm, he immediately vanishes out of your sight, out of the winter and back into it again. So this life of man appears just for a moment. We're like that little sparrow now. That is, where we are now, saying, this, what we experience here, this is the little bit of warmth. I know it sometimes doesn't seem that way. I'm sure to most people in Syria today, it doesn't seem, probably to a hell of a lot of Christians in Egypt, it doesn't seem very warm. Okay? We have a little bit of knowledge right now. We have a little bit of peace. We don't know what happened before, and we don't know what's coming next. But if this new doctrine contains anything more certain, it seems right that we should follow it. In other words, if this new teaching tells us anything about this or this, we should accept it. Because what does this tell us about this?
Nothing.
Nothing. What does this tell us about this? Yeah, it's not going to be good. Okay? So if this new doctrine can tell us more, he says we should accept it. What is he really saying? We have two competing stories. Two competing stories about life. If one of them seems better, he says, we should choose it. Okay? Pick two competing stories. Pick two competing works of 20th century literature. The ones I used in my first class were, pick, because I read something about J.D. Salinger the other day, Catcher in the Rye, and Lion Witch. Catcher in the Rye. Kind of bleak, kind of dark. Lion Witch in the Wardrobe. Kind of positive. Is it free of war? Is it free of hatred and prejudice? No, it's got all of those things. Or Catcher in the Rye and Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Okay? Those are two competing views. He is saying if this one tells us more or is better, I think we ought to go with this one. Well, pretty much, can much be worse than this? Catcher in the Rye, Brave New World, 1984, Fahrenheit 451, Lord of the Flies. they're pretty much, current embodiments of this mentality. Okay? So Coife says, let's hear some more of what Paulinus has to say. And the king says, that's good. Yeah, go ahead. And apparently Paulinus speaks, because the next thing we hear, Coife cries out, I have long realized that our religion is worthless. It doesn't work. It doesn't do any good. The more diligently I sought the truth in our worship, the less I found it. Notice, sought the truth. That's, knowledge. That's factual kind of information. It's not only factual information, but it also includes that. It's rational, in other words. But now I freely confess that such truth shines forth clearly in this preaching. Why? Because it can bestow on us three things. That is, the Christian story can bestow on us the gift of life. What does it mean? It has two meanings. One, it tells us what life is from. In other words, it answers what came before. In the beginning, God. That's what comes before. God made Adam and Eve. God made man in his own image. All that kind of stuff. All right? So that's one. What else? Okay. Salvation. In other words, life here does have a purpose. It does have meaning. It's not you just, live your life like a pig at the trough and then you die and that's it. It has value. And lastly, eternal happiness. See, the way the early church described heaven was not like the image you kind of get in popular mythology or consciousness today of people who are extremely bored, sitting around on the clouds with a harp going, oh, praise Jesus. Yeah, this is fun. Meanwhile, secretly wishing they were down in hell, roasting marshmallows with the people having a party down there. No. The way the early church described heaven was a party, revelry, feasting. Think of the best party you've been to in terms of tables just loaded with food. And inject that thing on steroids like to the millionth degree, and that would be heaven. Best beer, best wine, best singing, best dancing, all your favorite people there.
And then add not no foot race.
Yeah. It's just the most fun you could imagine. Okay? That was their conception of heaven. So he's saying, okay. So over here we have death, destruction, darkness, despair. And over here, feasting, joy, revelry for eternity. I don't really think it's much of a decision there, old king. And Edwin chooses door number 2. Okay? He accepts the gospel, he renounces idolatry, he confesses his faith in Christ. They tear down the altars to the profane gods. They build churches, the whole 9 yards. Okay? And by the way, it's from Gregory the Great, because he wrote to Augustine about this. It's from Gregory the Great that you get the church going throughout, or Christians going throughout England, and taking over places that had been sacrificed to idols, and turning those places into Christian places, baptizing them, cleansing them, okay? And they do the same thing with pagan holidays. So that the quote-unquote holiday that is coming up at the end of October, okay, with Beltane, I can't remember what the Celtic one. Samhain, okay, Samhain. October 31st instead becomes All Hallows Eve to celebrate All Hallows Day on November 1st. Okay? The day that gets changed to modern English Easter, okay, had originally been a day in honor of Eostra, an earth goddess in the native Germanic religion. All right? Christmas Day was previously the pagan Saturnalia, Roman feast day and such. Okay, skip over to page 21. And the Abbess Hild. We're not going to talk about Hild herself because we're more interested in the character of Caedmon. But it's in Hild's last year of her life that this cowherd has this vision. And according to Bede, this is what happened. Caedmon, this is page 22, left-hand column. Caedmon lived in the secular life until he was well advanced in years, meaning he was probably in his 30s. Right? What else? He'd never learned any verses. That is, he'd never learned any poetry or any songs, meaning he didn't know how to sing. Not that he couldn't carry a tune. It's not what that means. This is what it means, and we're going to talk about this in just a moment. And we're told that sometimes at feasts, when it was agreed for the sake of entertainment that all present should take a turn singing, when Caedmon saw the harp coming to him, he would quietly get up and leave. Now, the word that gets translated feasts there is not the Old English fest. It's the Old English Yabershipa, beership. You know, like fellowship and friendship. Partying, in other words. This is when the beer would flow freely. Okay, this is at a monastery. Most people today think monasteries, monks in brown or black habits, living dour lives, no joy, no fun. Nah, not in these monasteries. Okay? So the beer would flow. And we have a couple of examples of how the beer would flow. They wouldn't pass around, a cup, a flagon, or even a beer stein. They would pass around a bucket of beer. And the way you drank the beer is the bucket would rest against your forearms, and your hands would grip the lid, and you drink it like this. You tip it back against your head and swallow as much as you can. And you pass it down to the next person. Right? So probably Caedmon gets the beer, and then the harp's making its way, and he gets up and leaves. Probably one of the reasons he falls asleep so quickly is because of the amount of beer he had. Okay? And he goes to sleep and he has a vision. And in the vision, somebody standing in front of him says, "Caedmon, sing me something." "Caedmon, I can't sing. That's why I left the feast." And then the speaker says, "Nevertheless, you must sing to me." But in the Old English, which is translated from Bede's Latin, okay, and Bede writes it in Latin, he's translating that from what would have been the native Old English. And Bede possibly knew Caedmon. Okay, he was alive at this time. It doesn't say nevertheless. What it really says is, "Caedmon, sing to me." In other words, he pretty much just repeats what he said the first time. In kind of an imperative fashion. Like, shut up and sing. And how do we know? Because look at what Caedmon says. What shall I sing? In other words, okay, I'll try. Sing about the beginning of created things. In other words, sing about creation. And Caedmon sings. This is what it means that Caedmon sings. Turn to the right-hand column, page 23. You have Caedmon's hymn in Old English. All right? Bede, when Bede writes his ecclesiastical history of the English people, Bede puts Caedmon's hymn in Latin. But we have manuscripts of Bede, okay, that have the Old English written in elsewhere. That is a margin at the bottom of the page, a margin on one of the inside, what's called gutters, and then another one, if I remember right, has it interlinearly. That is, right after the first line of the Latin, it has the first line in the Old English. Okay, so somebody early on had gone through and retranslated it back into Old English, and they pretty much agree. There's a few slight word changes. So this is what Caedmon's hymn sounds like in Anglo-Saxon. Nu schulen herjan heaven reaches where on his modjathonk. Werk wuldervader, swahi wundra jahwas. Eetje drichten ora astelde. He erst schop jelda bernum, heaven tohrova heilig schipend. Tha middenjaard mankiniswaard, eetje drichten efterterde. Firm folden, freya almichtig. Okay? That's what Caedmon sings. He wakes up in the morning, he remembers what happened, and he goes off to the steward, his boss, and he tells him. Steward takes him to Abbot's Hill. Why? They need to make sure that this vision that he had was from God and not from the other place. So they tell him a biblical story. Caedmon goes off, he comes back, and he's turned that biblical story into another poem. So they realize, okay, this is from God. This is a great talent and gift. He needs to start composing verse. So they send him off with more priests, and according to Bede, Caedmon comes back, and he's composed poetry about the book of Genesis, about the fall of the angels. He's composed poetry about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. He's composed poetry about Daniel in the lion's den, and a whole bunch of stuff. Well, lo and behold, there's a manuscript in Oxford called Manuscript Junius 11. And all of the poems in the manuscript match almost identically what Bede says are the poems Caedmon composed. Up until about middle to late 19th century, this used to be called the Caedmon manuscript because it was assumed these are the poems Caedmon wrote. Nobody today believes these are the poems Caedmon wrote. Okay? Simply because there's no proof at all. Other than that, they're on these kinds of things. Well, other people wrote similar themed poems as well. Okay? And then Caedmon dies and such. Now, I talked the other day a little bit about why Caedmon was important. So let's talk, which I'll go back to. I said this is what it means when Caedmon says, I can't sing. It's not that he doesn't have a voice. It's that he doesn't understand the rules or the laws of the native alliterative Germanic meter. Now, these aren't rules and laws in the sense that we have a book that survives from 800 AD called The Rules or Laws of Germanic Meter. We do have a book from much later where a guy does talk about certain aspects of Germanic literature and poetry. Okay? These rules or laws are formulated on the basis of an examination of the earliest Germanic poetry up until about 1400 or so. Okay? Old English, Old Norse, Old High German, Middle High German, High German. And the poetry written in those languages all follows this pattern. Okay? So let's look at these individually. 1, each line of verse has 4 accented syllables. Let me take this off for a moment. And write down There are, as I said, a couple of differences in the version, so I just want to make sure I'm using the right one. Yeah. So each line of verse has 4 stressed accented syllables. Each line of verse comprises 2 half lines. Usually, like in the book you have in front of you, they show that division between the 2 half lines with this big break, which in later poetry is called a caesura. Okay? So each line has 2 half lines. This is 1A, this is 1B, this is 2A, this is 2B, all the way down. So Beowulf, for example, has 3,182 lines. So you'll see references or quotations, line 2,368A or 2,368 through 2,370A, because they're not including the second half of the line in the quotation. All right? Each half line has 2 stressed syllables. So somewhere over here, you've got 2 stresses. Somewhere over here, you've got 2 stresses. All right? That part's all pretty easy. That is, these 3 parts are all pretty easy. You've got a total of 4 stressed syllables per line. You could have a whole bunch of unstressed syllables. Could be 4, could be 6, could be 8. All right? Then you get down here. Only the first 3 stressed or accented syllables may alliterate. In other words, the 4th stressed or accented syllable never alliterates. And when I say never, I mean, yeah, there are a couple of times or a few times when it does, but it almost always appears accidental, right? At least for B, 1 stressed or accented syllable from the first half line must alliterate with the first stressed syllable of the second half line. And that gets us to point 5. What determines the alliteration? It's not the first half line, even though that's what your eyes see first on the page. What determines the alliteration is the first stressed syllable in the second half line. Okay? This is one of the things that kind of makes it hard to scan Old English poetry. All right? And that first stressed syllable of the second half line is called the head stave. Why? Head stave, stave like staff, means it's determining what the other staves, the other accented syllables are. Right? Any vowel may alliterate with any other vowel. In other words, A alliterates with O. Huh? Yeah, it does. A alliterates with E. I alliterates with oo. You need an example? Right here. Eetje drichten or astelda. Eetje dricht, unaccented. Drichten, it's unaccented. Or the is unaccented. Why? Because it would alliterate. Okay, so it doesn't. It's also a prefix. The accent is here, and this is unaccented. All right? So any vowel can alliterate with any other vowel. Other syllables may alliterate, but if they do, they don't count because they're not stressed. The only alliterative syllables that count are those that are stressed. Okay? So what are some rules for stress? Nouns. Look for a noun to look for a stress. Verbs in this kind of in this order: nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Pronouns, things like conjunctions, they'll never alliterate. Okay. Things like prefixes, okay, and here they'll never alliterate. Words like this will have stress, okay, and then they'll also have sometimes secondary stress. Heaven reaches word, okay? Stress, this is called secondary stress, all right? So take a look at this again, and we'll talk a little bit about this. You can just look at the lines, these 5, and you can see the alliteration, right? This one, it's kind of harder. But there's a stress and there's a stress. Notice, only 2 of the stresses here alliterate. That's that point. All right? This one's kind of easier. M. All right? This one's also kind of easy. What? This one, Yelda ist. Okay? So, again, you've got all kinds of syllables here that aren't alliterating. Okay? Or that don't have any stress. Mode, no stress. Stress, notice the last one doesn't alliterate with the others. This is another one that again has no stress on the or, and then fa does have a stress. Now, I'm not going to give you a piece of poetry and say, okay, do the scansion for me. I do that for graduate students. I hate it because it gets pretty complicated. But you do need to know this stuff because it is important. Later on, when we get to the Middle Ages, we're not reading, I don't think, any Piers Plowman. We're not reading any Piers Plowman. But in the vision of Piers Plowman, written during what's called the alliterative revival, that is, this is in the mid-1300s, when there's this kind of revival of trying to restore and revive the Anglo-Saxon poetic meter, they don't understand how this works. Because Piers Plowman writes, or in the vision of Piers Plowman, it is written, in a fair field full of folk found I there. Okay. The problem is that each one of these is stressed. Fair field, full, folk, found. Well, you've got 5 stresses, and every one of them alliterates. So that later on in the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer has a character say, I don't understand this modern riff, raff, rough. And what he's doing there is he's poking fun at this kind of writing. You would never see something like this in Anglo-Saxon. Okay? You do have a couple of times where you have really long lines where, for example, there's a passage in The Dream of the Rood that we'll talk about that has 8 stressed syllables. They've essentially taken a line and doubled it. Well, you could take that line and you could still apply this because you could apply that, take that line and say, actually, this is 2 lines, even though it's not literally. Okay? So you need to kind of commit this to memory, or at least learn it, not that you'll have to practice it or anything like that, but it will come up on the exam. Let me, before we go on, before we stop, because we're going to stop early, let me just read that Old English to you again. And we'll look at a couple of the words here. Because Old English is a dead language. Okay, a lot of people say that, a lot of people used to say, that English literature began with Chaucer. No, it didn't. English literature begins with this, Caedmon's hymn. We can date Caedmon. We can date the hymn, 680. Okay? Chaucer's 1385. 700 years later. All right? So we can date this. The reason they say Chaucer is the beginning of English literature, because any English speaker today can pick up Chaucer and work their way through it. You can't pick up Old English on your own, just a book of it, and start making your way through it. I mean, look at page 23. Nu schulen herian heaven reaches where. How many of those words are in modern English? Well, in those forms, none. But new is, because it's now. Right? There's a thing that occurs in a period from about 13, begins about 1300, ends around 1700, called the Great Vowel Shift. When all what are called the long vowels move up. They change place. Nu becomes now. Okay? Ah becomes a. Chaucer would have said the word take, he would have said talk. Ta, te, kind of a thing. I'll explain this later if you want to get into it more. Take history of the English language class and you'll learn it very well. So, nu schulen herian haven't reaches word. If you take the words apart a little bit, you can start to see some modern English words there. Nu, now, schulen, change the vowel, shall, now must. Okay, herion is praise, and there's a we implied. Heaven reaches. If you're familiar with Harry Potter and the name Godric, it's this word. It's the word from which Hitler wanted to raise the Third Reich kingdom. The heavenly kingdom. Word. We have this word in modern English. It's just spelled and pronounced slightly differently. Who is the person who is in charge of a prison? A warden. Okay? He's the guard. That's what word is. The guardian of the heavenly kingdom. Methodus completely drops out. Means measurer. But machta stays in. It's might. The measurer's might. And his. It's the exact same word. His. Modyathunk. Mode changes a little bit, begin, because the vowel changes. It's one of those long vowels, it jumps up. Mood. Mood. If someone's moody, they're full of their own thoughts. Okay? Modyathunk is the mind's thoughts. Thonk there, if you're familiar with J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, or thonk. First thought. That is what that means. The work, change the spelling a little bit, pronunciation slightly, work, okay, of the Wooldor, that word completely drops out. Glory, fatter, that's pretty clear. Swa is so, the W drops off, the ah becomes O. Hey, wundra, wonders, each one. Echa, eternal, that completely drops off. Drifting completely dies out. Okay, or the next two words completely die out, or astelda. Hey, he, erist, like when you say or read in a story, ere he comes, before he erist, beforest, it means first. Okay, shope. Change the vowel. Just go through the vowels. Shope. A. Shape. Sheep. Shipe. Shope. Shoop. Okay. None of those are words other than shape in sheep. He first sheeped. Doesn't make any sense. He first shaped. That word shope is past tense for shape. Okay. But it's also the word in Old English for poet or singer. Because what does a poet or singer do? They shape with words. You listen to a singer, you listen to a storyteller, and what does the storyteller do? If you close your eyes, and open your mind, that storyteller creates images, shapes, things in your mind. Read what Duke Theseus says in A Midsummer Night's Dream, okay, about what the poet, the madman, and the lover do. Okay, he says the poet gives shape to airy nothing. Hamlet wasn't real, and yet Hamlet is in our popular consciousness. Okay, heaven as a roof, heaven to Hrova, Hali, holy, Shippend, that's shaper. God is a shaper. After all, in the beginning, he made the heavens and the earth, the whole 9 yards. Then, Fa midden yard, middle earth, that's where Tolkien gets the name from. Mankinisward, mankind's guardian. Okay? So God is the heavenly kingdom's guardian, and he's also mankind's guardian. The eternal Lord, he later established the earth for men, the Freya Allmächtig. Freya. Freya doesn't mean God or Lord Almighty. Freya means friend, the almighty friend. It's also one of the names of one of the Norse gods. Okay? All right, we'll stop there. For Tuesday, on the syllabus, I only have the Wanderer. I want you to read the Seafarer too. It'll take all of maybe 2 more minutes. Okay? Just in case we get through all of the Wanderer in time and we can start the Seafarer. Because if we can build up a little bit of time, then we won't get too far behind when I get to Beowulf and take 10 days rather than 6 days, more than likely.